25 years of strict regime and spent time in a disciplinary cell. So, you know, he loses feeling in both his feet and his left hand, and he makes jokes about it. He remembers that episode of The Simpsons, we both like The Simpsons, where you remember that very old gentleman who used this walker to move around. So Vladimir jokes about him having to use this walker when he's out of prison, so that I would have one ready for him when he comes back. So, you know, I don't know how he does it. Very often I ask myself how he does it.
It's incredible. And I would say a few things. This film, all of his films are available on YouTube with English subtitles if you want to watch all of them. So this is his most recent film. They Chose Freedom as his first film, like Evgenia mentioned, when he was a little bit younger. It's just a wonderful presentation of the very kind of brave and courageous generation before Vladimir, before Boris Nemtsov, before Alexei Navalny, of those who stood up and protested and pushed back during the Soviet era. That's a wonderful film. The film in the middle of these two is Nemtsov, about, you mentioned sadly your daughter's godfather, the longtime political dissident that we mentioned, anti-corruption advocate, who was assassinated a few years ago, just a few hundred yards outside of the Kremlin. So I would invite you all to definitely watch those films, get a better feel for Vladimir again, before we can have him back in Houston at some point. And of course, for any of you who weren't able to attend last year when we hosted him, our video of the event and the conversation with Vladimir is on the Council's YouTube channel. It's just look up World Affairs Council of Houston YouTube, and you'll find Vladimir Kara-Murza. The film, maybe let's talk about it. We can talk, instead of talking about after, talk a little bit about before. It's a fascinating...
It's going to take a couple minutes. We have to reboot the system.
Just tell us what.
Kind of serve.
Okay.
All right.
Okay.
We can talk.
And will that apply to the mics too then?
Yes.
Well, afterwards. Okay, that's fine.
Come back.
But just for people to get an idea of what you're seeing, Father Edelstein, incredible, courageous person speaking out for many, many years in Soviet Russia, continue to speak out. The film, Vladimir finished it about 2 or 3 years ago, so maybe you can just give people an update in advance for Father Edelstein now, and his own, and what happened even for him when the war was kind of restarted or re-escalated by Putin last year.
Okay. Well, Father Edelstein is truly someone remarkable, and that inner strength that he has is absolutely astonishing. And of course, when the full-scale invasion broke out, he didn't hesitate a second. This 90-year-old man did not hesitate a second before speaking out and calling it a crime and denouncing it. And his one of his sons, Yulia Edelstein, was a refusnik, spent some time in the Soviet Gulag, and then emigrated to Israel and became an Israeli statesman and was Speaker of the Israeli Parliament. And is still very much deeply involved in Israeli politics. And he managed to convince Father Georgi to come and visit him for a little bit in Israel because, well, he's 90 years old, and although the Russian authorities would not stop before, would not stop at arresting a 90-year-old man, and it's because it happens, there are cases. So Father Georgi is now in Israel with his son and cannot wait to return to his parish in Kostroma. He remains very active, very open in his opinions. He just sent me birthday wishes for Vladimir, and we talked a few times over the past 17 months of after Vladimir's arrest. I do understand why Vladimir is honored and happy to know Father Georgi. This is a man, a true Orthodox priest, Russian Orthodox priest, as a priest should be. I mean, I'm not talking about Patriarch Kirill, right? I'm talking about a true, genuine Orthodox priest, a leader of his parish, someone who offers guidance, someone who exhibits tolerance, someone who talks about love and forgiveness, someone who, well, if only the current leaders of the Russian Orthodox Church were all like Father Georgy, I believe that this war could have already ended. Yeah, and that's Father Georgy, I think, talking to us. Yeah, I want to speak too. Yes.
And maybe I would just help, especially our American audience, who, for a lot of us, we think of the Soviet Union, we think of Stalin and his successors, obviously, crushing and repressing the church, crushing and repressing, whether it be Christianity or Judaism, any form of faith and religion. The new faith is your faith and your belief should be, you believe in Stalin after him, and you believe in communism. This film is interesting that it shows, yes, many of the churches were destroyed, people's faith was suppressed, but there was also, sadly, infiltration and collaboration and co-opting by the KGB of some of the leadership of the Orthodox Church. And now, sadly, a generation later, we have some of the same examples happening again with the leadership now. Can you discuss that? Maybe to help people understand the film better, too.
It's a very sad situation, and well, that part of the Russian Orthodox Church that was prepared to cooperate with the state in the Soviet times was allowed to continue existing as long as it served the purposes, the specific purposes. That part of the church that was not prepared to do that had to basically split with the Moscow Patriarchy. And some years ago, they became united again, too early, I believe, because nowadays we're dealing with the same problem. Patriarch Kirill it's a known fact about him that he is an FSB officer, an FSB agent, and he's an extremely wealthy man. And the church leadership, you can only occupy one of those leadership positions if you completely support the official line. And that is, of course, absolutely unacceptable in a church. First of all, a church should never be united with the state. It's not how it should exist. A church should be absolutely independent. And, since many of today's leaders of the Russian Orthodox Church are themselves very much involved with Russian secret services, of course, we cannot talk about any kind of separation between church and the state again. The story about what was happening to the church in the Soviet times is very well told in the film, and also the story of Father Georgy himself, who remained part of that system, but managed to not ever betray his principles and his views. So those cases were also known, but of course, at some point, he lost his parish, and you're gonna see it all, I hope. Yeah. He, as Vladimir said in his letter, he was restored to his parish by President Reagan, of all people, right? So, by an American president. Shall we?
That's great.
Wonderful.
And just to let you all know, we'll watch the film. I might have one or two more things to kind of wrap everything up, Yulia, for a few questions. It's really a great reflection of the last generation of Russians who are courageous enough to stand out and speak for, for all Russians and for common decency and human rights. Obviously, to me, what's wonderful is, I feel privileged to get to know Vladimir a bit. When we hosted him and my correspondences with him before that and shortly after. The same incredible sense of morality and decency and humanity that I think we all see in Father Georgi. Obviously is reflected in Vladimir, and honestly I think is definitely reflected in you. If I might say to you, just something touching for me this morning, a lot of times when we host films, I always ask if we're hosting the director or someone's in a documentary, and they may have seen the film dozens and dozens of times. I say, would you like to watch the film, or if you have work you need to do, and Evgenia has an incredible amount of work, endless emails and phone calls and interviews and whatnot. I will say that, would you like to, when we play the film, would you like to take a moment and just step outside and take care of some work, whatever you need to do. And you very sweetly and kindly, and I think a reflection of the true compassion and love between the two of you, said, no, Ronan, I love seeing that film every time as much as I can. I love to see Vladimir and to hear Vladimir, and I'm glad all of you got to see him there. I welcome you if you have any of your questions. My colleagues collecting those question cards. We covered some of it beforehand. We kind of have an interrupted conversation, but it's fine. I think it's working great. Just to kind of give people an update, we touched upon some of it already. And again, I think it's very important to highlight that there are Russians speaking out. There are Russians trying to do the right thing, whether you want to call them opposition figures or human rights activists. It's very difficult. It's very hard to speak out in Russia. Not just will you be punished, potentially your entire family will be punished. But can you give us kind of a bit more of an update on Vladimir? And maybe just kind of, it's interesting that you saw a recent op-ed that he had in the Washington Post about how he was called to be a character witness in the case of Alexei Navalny. And cruelly, they're friends that worked together for many years, a common cause. Vladimir was sentenced to 25 years, more than anybody, even more than Alexei Navalny got 19 or something, I can't remember. Maybe you could just kind of recount that story, and maybe if you could just give a bit of an overview of where some of the kind of, these kind of human and strong kind of, voices for human rights are in Russia today.
That op-ed that you're talking about is called, I believe, A Traitor, a Defense Witness for an Extremist. So yeah, it was published by the Washington Post, and Vladimir talks about how he hadn't seen Alexei for a while, and then the first time they met after all this time was when he was called to be a witness in the prosecution case against Alexei, and they talked by video. They were not even placed in the same room. They talked by the video, and every time, so it sort of reflects the absolute Kafkaesque reality of today's Russia. This is what is happening in the country on the large scale. And talking about Vladimir, I already said that 3 days before his birthday, his transfer began. I am sure that it was no coincidence, because the Russian authorities knew that he would be receiving words of support and letters from his kids. Our kids had been working on these letters for a while. Every time they write to their father, they write in Russian, and they draw pictures, and so the authorities made sure that he would not receive any of that. They sent him to Siberia 3 days before his birthday. But more than that, and this is, I don't know whether to laugh or to cry, because it just crosses all the, it's like mind-boggling. So his lawyers spent 2 days trying to locate him and sending requests and demands in all directions. And on Wednesday, they were told that Vladimir has reached this detention center in Omsk, about 2,000 miles away from Moscow. And a friend of ours, the wife of another political prisoner and Vladimir's friend, Andrei Pivovarov, who spent almost 3 years in prison by now, tried to send Vladimir a letter there. to that Omsk detention center using this specific online system of letters that you can use in Russia to send letters to any prison around the country. And she received a message that said that this detention center, the entire detention center, stopped receiving correspondence for an undetermined period. So, you know, not only did they send Vladimir on this transfer 3 days before his birthday, but the entire prison in Omsk was deprived of correspondence because it was my husband's birthday. This is so ridiculous that I honestly, I don't know whether to laugh or to cry. And maybe if my kids' faces were so sad, I'd laugh. But this morning, at 6 a.m., I was woken up by my oldest daughter calling me from home in tears, in hysterics, because it is her father's birthday and she cannot even tell him she loves him. She cannot. Nothing. And so this is the same girl, the 17-year-old girl, very strong and resilient girl who 2 days after her father's verdict in April stood before a room full of, in Congress, in US Congress, full of US senators and congressmen, and made an amazing speech in support of her father and in support of political prisoners in the Russian Federation. And I was looking at her then, and I was thinking, wow, a grown-up, young, independent lady. And today I was listening to her sob on the phone, and I was thinking, oh my God, my little girl. So if it weren't so sad, I'd laugh. But this is the reality, and you know, what helps is to remind myself that we're not in the worst situation here. Absolutely not. Because our kids are living under their own roof. They go to their school, they have their friends, they're not forced to run to a bomb shelter several times a day. They don't lose their loved ones. They don't lose their homes. They have at least that, you know, to take them through this very difficult period in their lives. And I know that I'm in a much better position than parents in Russia who send their kids to school, where every week begins with a lesson about what's important. When the kids in schools are explained why this criminal aggression against Ukraine is a noble cause, or something like this. They are not subject to propaganda on a daily basis through these stupid textbooks that are rewriting history yet again in our country. And I definitely am in a much better position than those parents in Russia who, like Alexei Moskalyov, whose daughter drew an anti-war picture, and he ended up in prison because of that. And his daughter was taken away from him. Or a very similar case in Buryatia with Natalia Filonova. She is an anti-war activist who was just sentenced to almost 3 years for beating up policemen, as the official report said. This is a 65-year-old woman beating up 3 or 4 policemen who were arresting her, yes. Her adopted son was taken away from her and placed in an orphanage forcefully. She has a husband and other relatives who are very willing to take care of the boy, but no, he was taken away from them and placed in an orphanage because the Russian authorities deemed them unable to raise a strong Russian patriot. So, you know, and there's another story that just wouldn't leave my mind for many weeks now, and that's the story of Anatoly Berezikov, an anti-war activist in Rostov-on-Don. He was arrested for putting up leaflets of the Ukrainian project I Want to Live that helps Russian soldiers surrender.
He was 40 years old, the same age as Vladimir and I. He was arrested, repeatedly beaten up and tortured in jail. And one day when his lawyer came to visit him there, she saw his body being carried out of the prison. He did tell her about threats by police officers, and she has pictures of the traces of electroshock on his body, so she believes that he was tortured to death. Can you imagine a person tortured to death for putting up leaflets of the project I Want to Live? So reminding myself of all these stories does help me in my work, because I know, I remember that during his trial, Anatoly Berezikov repeatedly said how afraid he was that he would just be forgotten, that he would just disappear into nowhere. So I need his story to be known. I need the story of Maria Ponomarenko to be known, who went through forceful punitive psychiatry. You know, we're back in the Soviet times. One of the protagonists actually three of the protagonists of Vladimir's first documentary, They Chose Freedom, Viktor Feinberg, Natalia Gorbanevska, and Vladimir Bukovsky went through punitive psychiatry. And I remember how Natalia Gorbanevska talked about this. She said, well, every day you wake up and you check yourself. Am I still in my right mind? Or have I already lost it? How do I know? And so Maria Ponomarenko was arrested shortly after the beginning of the full-scale invasion for posting pictures about the bombing of the theater in Mariupol. And after several months in pretrial detention, she was sent to a psychiatric hospital for a so-called evaluation, where she was injected with unknown substances and tortured. When she was able to speak to her lawyer after that, she said that she could not recollect 3 whole days of her stay at the so-called hospital because she was under the influence of unknown substances. That is punitive psychiatry that is again being used. Of course, she was sentenced and is now serving her sentence, and her 2 teenage daughters are left without their mom. I want to know the stories of Alexei Gorinov, the first municipal deputy in Moscow who spoke against the invasion of Ukraine during a meeting of the council, of the municipal council in Moscow. He said that it would be unethical to hold children's drawing contests. That was on the agenda, I guess. Drawing contests or dance contests while kids in Ukraine were dying on a daily basis. For that, this man was sentenced to 7 years. The story of Evgenia Bestuzhev, who is denied crucial medical care. He is suffering from a heart condition and can basically die any moment. The stories of all those activists of Crimean Solidarity that were arrested in Crimea and then moved to prisons inside of Russia. And they are suffering terrible fates because they have no contact with their loved ones, they have no medical help whatsoever, and they're serving absolutely atrocious sentences of 10, 15, 17 years because they're being accused of terrorism, extremism, things like that. So these stories need to be told because I want to, and my husband has been trying to do that for many years, to show to the world the nature of Vladimir Putin's regime. What we're witnessing today in Ukraine, that is the result of over 2 decades of impunity that Vladimir Putin has enjoyed while committing the very similar crimes. Time and again, he would try his hand at a new crime and look and wait for the response, for the reaction. The reaction would not come, and he would try his hand again. The invasion of Georgia, violent beating of peaceful protesters in the Moscow Bolotnaya Square in 2012. the annexation of Crimea, the bombing of civilians, the killing of civilians in Syria. Oh, I forgot, the war in Chechnya, the second war that came as the result of the first one. So none of it received the proper reaction either from the Russian population or from leaders in the West. And time and again, Vladimir Putin was allowed to get away with it. So imagine his logic, the very warped logic of a bully, a classic bully. If I can annex Crimea, why can't I go and annex the rest of Ukraine? If I can kill civilians in Syria, why can't I do the same thing in Ukraine? If I am allowed to beat people into pulp in the streets of Moscow, why can't I throw them in prison in thousands and use punitive psychiatry against them? Why not? Why indeed not? So this is the result of over 2 decades of impunity, and this impunity has got to stop. So every time I hear people starting, some officials in the West calling for negotiations with Vladimir Putin, I feel rage. I cannot describe, because these people, these Ukrainians who lost, many of them, everything, at least 500 kids dead as the result of the aggression, how many thousands mutilated, and negotiations, giving Vladimir Putin part of Ukraine, the Donetsk and Luhansk, Crimea, so that what? So that he could represent this yet again as a victory in Russia? To that part of the population has been severely brainwashed by his propaganda for over 20 years. And so that in a few years he would start yet another campaign. The Baltic states are there, Moldova is just next door. So I have to continue Vladimir's work, talking about this impunity and the need for it to stop, and for need to all those responsible for the crime of aggression against Ukraine, for war crimes committed on its territory, and for the crimes committed against the Russian population. I want them to be brought to justice. They need to stand justice, and thus all other dictators, autocrats of the world will understand that they would not be able to get away with anything similar. Because all dictators, honestly, they look at each other and they learn from each other. Vladimir Putin has used Belarus for years as a testing ground. Whatever happens in Belarus today will happen in Russia tomorrow. We know that. So these dictators learn from each other, and a bully does not understand compromise. This has got to be clear. A bully does not understand the notion of compromise. A bully sees a compromise as a weakness of his opponent, and a bully will continue pushing until he's stopped, until he's punished for his deeds. That is the nature of bullies, and Vladimir Putin is a classic one. So, talking about our family, yeah, it's not easy. Our family, just like the war in Ukraine that really started in 2014 with the annexation of Crimea, our family has been going through hell for years. My husband was first poisoned in 2015, 3 months after the assassination of Boris Nemtsov in Moscow. Exactly 3 months to the day. He slipped in a coma. And it took him for over a year to relearn how to walk, hold a spoon, carry out the simplest of tasks. All this happened in front of our kids. And I was literally carrying Vladimir around the house in my arms because he was so weak that he couldn't walk. He was throwing up every couple of hours at the beginning, every 15 minutes, then half an hour, then a couple of hours, an hour, then 9-year-old daughter, the oldest one, she was 9 at the time, she would know what was happening. She would run with a bucket to her father, who was, lying on the couch because he couldn't stand. And a trip to the mailbox was an adventure. He would return back home and collapse on the couch. And then it happened again in 2017. And again a coma, and again a multiple organ failure, and again he was lying there in a hospital bed, looking like an octopus, surrounded by all these machines. His heart didn't work, his kidneys didn't work, his lungs didn't work, nothing worked. This was... And I would bring him home here for rehabilitation, and he got up again. He relearned yet again how to walk, and he went back to Moscow to continue his fight. Because he says, I'm a Russian politician, I love my country, and I cannot call on people to continue resisting from a safe distance. I have to share the risk, I have to be there. And, over these past 17 months of going around the world and continuing his work, I have met so many of his friends. And every time I would meet someone else, they would begin by talking about their last meeting with Vladimir and how they tried to dissuade him from going back. Every single one. I could write a whole book of these stories, these conversations. But no, he goes back because he believes and he knows that there is a different Russia. And for years he has been the voice of hundreds of political prisoners in the Russian Federation. And now that he has joined their ranks, I have to be his voice and the voice of others as well.
Beautiful way to put it, and I might just, follow up on that. For anyone who says, is Vladimir naive, poisoned, almost killed twice, going back. For any of you who get a chance to read any of his works, or if hopefully maybe to meet him again at some point, Vladimir is brilliant. He absolutely knows the reality of what he was facing. When he was here last year, I asked, I said, Vladimir, why is it that you feel the strength and the drive and the conviction to go back knowing what you're facing? And, he said, at a certain point, Ronan, he said, it wasn't fair to you. And he said, and my children, to put them at risk. So, luckily they're out of the country now. He said, but if I don't go back, if I don't speak out, if no one speaks out in Russia, nothing will change. Just incredible courage and conviction. And just, Shane mentioned at the beginning the 30th October Foundation that was established in response to Vladimir's situation, but also more broadly, if you could talk about for all of the kind of Russian human rights activists, as you mentioned now, in some ways this is more dire and more difficult and more devious than it was during the Soviet era because of technology. They can track every phone call you make, everything you do on social media, all of the cameras across Red Square and cities across all of Russia. They know where you are, what you're doing, where you're going. So for anyone who says, why don't more Russians speak out, they are doing it. It is extremely hard, it is extremely dangerous. And as you're, unfortunately, a pure example of, it's very difficult on your families. It's not just the political prisoner who's going to prison, it's a family who's losing their father or their mother, or recently, some cases, their father and the mother may have been put in prison after some of the people who protested against the war last year. Can you talk about the kind of broader sense of difficulty, but also the courage and inspiration that Vladimir and other kind of human rights activists in Russia take to keep going, to keep pushing forward during these hard times?
It's very, Rana, it's very hard to talk about what's pushing them, what's driving them. I think we should wait for Vladimir to come back and tell us about it. I don't know. You said that it's hard on families. It is definitely very hard. I think, well, honestly, I spoiled my husband. He knows that I'm going to be there. He knows it because I love the man, and I am maybe old-fashioned, but for me, well, I married the man to spend my life with him, and I'm not going to run at the first difficulty. That was not the idea. Besides, we do have 3 kids. I need him back in the picture, so he better return and do his part. I'm not raising these kids on my own. I need his input. Our little boy is growing up. The girls are getting their first boyfriend. So yeah, I need him back in the picture. That 30th October Foundation was Vladimir's idea, of course, as all the brilliant ideas. Last year, he became the recipient of 2 prizes, the Václav Havel Human Rights Prize, discerned by the Council of Europe, and the Axel Springer Foundation Prize, and they have a monetary part. So Vladimir decided to use this money to support families of political prisoners because, well, being behind bars, he realized how hard it is on families as well. And he knows that there are many families who, for whom it's very hard to survive without a provider. These families not only lose their loved ones, but a provider as well, and at least they could receive help with that. So we established this foundation on his behalf, and now this is the long bureaucratic process, etc. But we've established it, we've registered it, we're building a website. The foundation board is amazing. It has Professor Erwin Kotler, who you just saw on the screen, and Natan Shiransky, and Sergei Davidis from Memorial, and many other absolutely amazing people. Alexander Podrobinik, who's another well-known Soviet dissident. Well, we will have to find all the intricate ways to get this money to the families who need it, because as you well understand, nowadays it's a very tricky challenge. But we'll do it, because this is something that is absolutely needed in today's world. And well, as for what is driving these people, again, I think they are the best to talk about this. I know that very often I take inspiration from my husband, because I live with a guy who's, he's got an incredible sense of humor, and he's good with the kids. There is not one single thing that he didn't do with our babies when they were babies. I mean, the only thing he didn't do with them, he was afraid of cutting their small nails, because he was afraid, I'm going to cut off a finger, I cannot. So that was the only thing that I did, only I did with our kids. The rest of them, taking them to extracurricular activities, reading to them, cooking, feeding them, taking them on walks. He did it all. He's an amazing father. He's a great husband who is very patient with me, and I believe that I'm patient with him, so it's mutual. And the basis of our relationship is respect for each other. respect for each other, and patience with each other. And that is the foundation of love, I believe. And I think that that's what helps me now. And I think that I'm not the only one in this. I know about, I just mentioned the wife of our friend Andrei Pivovarov, Tatiana Usmanova, who fights fiercely for Andrei. I know many other family members of political prisoners who will not rest until their loved ones are back with them. And so I believe we're a force to be reckoned with.
And I would say at a bigger, broader, higher level, it's important to keep Vladimir and all the others, and Alexei Navalny and others, in the public sphere, people talking about it. Write your congressman or congresswoman, your senator or whatnot. I would say an example of it in 2 weeks, different country, but similar themes of autocratic regimes. We're hosting Jian Li Yang. He was a student protester at Tiananmen Square in 1989. He survived the massacre there. At least hundreds, maybe thousands of young people were killed by the Communist Party. He went into exile for 10 years, and I think some go back to see his family and whatnot. Understandably, when you leave, you have to cut off everything. He went back to China. He was arrested pretty much as soon as he landed. He was in prison for 5 years, almost all of that in solitary confinement, which is almost a worse form of torture than physical torture. And it was because of negotiations and by President Bush and his administration to negotiate his release. So I hope President Biden and people, both Democrats and Republicans at the highest levels in the United States, are keeping out for Vladimir. I want to turn to just a few audience questions, if you're okay, if you have the time for that. And for any of you who attended our event last night with former Speaker of the House, Nancy Pelosi, she was great, and from the stage mentioned Evgenia and Vladimir multiple times. So I think that's important to keep our politicians on both sides. I don't care if you're from the left or the right, liberal or conservative, talking about that. At the end of the day, this is very important human rights and decency across the world. Someone asked, what defense did your husband have at his trial? And maybe just can you talk about defense attorneys' abilities in Russia, and do they feel free or their liberty to actually kind of practice law? Can you talk about the process?
Excellent question. Very often I'm asked, what is the use of a lawyer in a repressive state that doesn't respect its own laws? So what can a lawyer do in a case where no defense evidence is ever admitted, where you cannot do anything, honestly, because no one is ever acquitted. I think it's less than 0.0 something % of acquittals in today's Russia. I always tell these people that lawyers working today in Russia, in Putin's Russia, as in any autocratic country, are heroes, truly. Not only are they very often the only link between a prisoner and his loved ones outside, but they're there to monitor, to put it all on paper, every single violation committed in those cases. Thanks to that, well, until recently, Russian citizens could apply to the European Court of Human Rights, but because Russia was expelled from the Council of Europe, now that venue has been closed to us, but there are other venues remaining at the United Nations, for example. There are thousands of cases that the European Court of Human Rights will still have to consider, cases submitted by Russian citizens, based on that information provided by lawyers over the years of violations in the cases of these people. And Vladimir, for example, has like 3 or 4 cases at the European Court of Human Rights, and already won one. Yes, already won one, and we're waiting for decisions on his other cases. My husband's lawyers were Vadim Prokhorov and Olga Mikhailova at the beginning. Vadim Prokhorov used to be Boris Nemtsov's lawyer, and after Boris's assassination, Vladimir and Vadim worked closely with then president of the OSCE, Margareta Sederfeld, on her report about the assassination of Boris Nemtsov. And I think that they became friends over the course of that work. And Vadim has since been representing Vladimir both in Russia and outside. He himself was threatened with a criminal case against him for standing up to the judge several times, and he was forced to leave the country. Vladimir has two lawyers now in Moscow, Maria Eisman and Anna Stavitskaya, amazing human rights defenders, highly professional in their field, and both human rights defenders. So they work with cases of political prisoners, thus putting themselves at risk every single day to be there for those persecuted for their anti-war and anti-Putin position. I am very worried about them, to tell the truth. Every day I speak to them, I am worried, and I don't know how they do their job. I know that our organization, the Free Russia Foundation, uses a network of lawyers working on the ground in Russia to locate Ukrainian war prisoners, for example. Because until they're located, physically located, they cannot be put on lists for exchanges. So using, their knowledge about how this system, this very crooked, very perverse system works, they can locate these people who are lost to the Ukrainian government, who are lost to the world, and then they can be exchanged. So these lawyers, again, are absolute heroes. So I think
Excellent.
I answered.
I think because a lot of people wonder, and to support, to highlight their courageous work as well. Just for the sake of time, maybe let's do three kind of quick questions, because I know that some of you may need to go, and you might be exhausted. It's been a very long and intense day for you. A very good question, kind of related to the film, and you touched upon it earlier, but maybe you could kind of help us get a better understanding. There's a name, so someone just wrote, has the war caused division within the Orthodox churches here in America? And maybe can you talk about maybe the broader impact and kind of schisms it's caused within the Orthodox churches, especially, say, Ukrainian and Russian in different parts of the world?
There is definitely a split before in the Orthodox Church in Ukraine, as I think should have been expected, knowing the position of Patriarch Kirill. As for divisions within the Russian Orthodox Church in Russia, there are priests, definitely, who, like Father Georgi, stand on an anti-war position and continue preaching it to their parishes. And at the beginning of the full-scale invasion, there was a letter calling for peace, calling for the end of war and end of atrocities, signed by almost 300 Russian Orthodox priests. And, well, just like any other anti-war activists in today's Russia, these priests very often come under the radar of the Russian authorities, or church authorities who are very much connected with the state and work work together. Many of them are being defrauded. Others are being forced to abandon their position. Many are trying to flee the country. So it's just the same situation as in any other area of society. Same persecution and same results. And I just recently read of a priest being convicted to several years, I believe in St. Petersburg. That trial had been ongoing for some time, and now it finished, and he was convicted for calling for the end of the war.
And I'll just, two more questions. There are two great questions from two great students, both from the Audi International School. First, Daria asks, can you talk more about the father Georgi and also the difficulty of opposing Putin and the immense sacrifices for all Russians? How do you ensure that the movement for democracy in Russia is not mostly comprised of highly educated Russians, or those with the resources to maybe protect themselves or get out of the country?
Well, thank you for the excellent question. Those NGOs who continue working in Russia, despite all the risks, and I mean many of them are banned or declared undesirable, but people are still working anonymously on the ground trying to collect information about these cases of persecution. So according to these NGOs, persecution, political repression does not only affect the highly educated or well-placed people. Taxists, engineers, military officers, teachers, anyone can come under the radar of the authorities and be persecuted for his or her position. So it's not really a matter of social standing or education or those things. Protests and arrests and detentions have been reported in at least 78 regions. Over 20,000 people have been arbitrarily detained across the country for voicing their opposition to the Russian government's war against Ukraine, and many of them are already serving sentences. Several laws have been passed to facilitate the work of the Russian authorities, like these laws on spreading so-called false information about the use of Russian armed forces. These laws were passed 9 days after the full-scale invasion had broken out. So 9 days after it broke out, the authorities realized that they needed instruments to go after those who will speak up, because people were protesting. And according to NGOs, according to Media Zona, Ovidinfo, Memorial Center, all of these organizations have been declared undesirable, have been banned in Russia. Arrests and detentions continue on a daily basis. There are no mass protests, it is true. Organizing a mass protest in a near totalitarian country is a very difficult thing, and very often it ends in bloodshed, like it happened in Iran, for example. But protests are ongoing, and every day someone gets arrested or sent to prison or sentenced. My husband had 3 charges against him, and I believe that his case is very illustrative because it shows, in his case, the authorities just used everything. They just piled it up, one charge on top of the other. But his case is very illustrative because it shows what kind of charges are being brought against people protesting against the government or against the war, or both. So the first charge brought against my husband was that for spreading false information about the use of Russian armed forces. He made this speech at the Arizona State Legislature in March of 2022, calling this a war of aggression, talking about war crimes committed in Ukraine, about the bombing of the maternity ward, about the killing of civilians and destroying of the civilian infrastructure, and he called for the formation of a Nuremberg-style tribunal to prosecute those responsible for the crimes. For that, they accused him of spreading false information about the use of Russian armed forces, and that law provides for a sentence of up to 15 years. For just, anything can be considered the spreading of false information. Making a post online, reposting someone else's post, going outside in the street with a slogan, "No war." People were arrested for staging protests with a copy of Leo Tolstoy's War and Peace. My favorite case was that several people were arrested in Moscow for staging a protest, a silent protest, as the official police report said, invisible anti-government signs. They were standing in the street like that.
And their sign, if you're wondering, their signs had nothing written on them. Yeah.
There were no
Yeah,
signs.
that's what I'm saying.
Invisible. But the
police
police were able to read anti-government slogans on these invisible signs. The second charge brought against my husband was that of being affiliated with an undesirable organization. Now, anything that has to do with human rights in Russia today is undesirable. We talk about the Sakharov Center. We talk about Memorial Center. We talk about all media projects, independent media projects. All of that is undesirable. And affiliation with an undesirable organization, again, can take many forms. You don't have to be a member of an undesirable organization to be prosecuted. You can come to a screening of a film, like this one, organized by, say, Sakharov Center, and you will be considered as affiliated with an undesirable organization. My husband was charged under this article for organizing an event in support of political prisoners at Moscow's Sakharov Center together with Memorial. That is a yearly event that takes place in October, actually, hence the name of the foundation, the 30th October Foundation. That was the day when in 1976 several Soviet dissidents in the Perm labor camps staged a hunger strike and began staging this hunger strike every year on the same day to sort of in remembrance for all those who perished in that fight, for all political prisoners in the Soviet Union. So that day was then adopted by the Memorial Center as the Political Prisoner Day in Russia. And my husband's idea is to make this day the International Day of Political Prisoners. And there was actually a resolution introduced in Congress by Congressman Cohen, who's the OSCE EPA Special Representative on Political Prisoners, to designate the 30th of October the International Day of Political Prisoners. Like Ronan said, if you could write to your congressman, to your senator, and tell him that it would be an excellent idea to designate a day of solidarity and support with political prisoners around the world, making the 30th of October the International Day of Political Prisoners, that would be excellent. That was the second accusation. And the third accusation against my husband is that of high treason. That accusation was based on 3 public speeches that he made at the US Congress, at the Norwegian Helsinki Committee, and I'm getting tired, I think I forgot the third one. So 3 public speeches that can be easily found online on YouTube, where he talks about political repression in Russia, where he talks about aggression of the current regime, and he talks about the illegal character, the illegal nature of Vladimir Putin's regime and that referendum that was carried out and basically destroyed the country's constitution, making Vladimir Putin into a Tsar forever. These 3 speeches were seen by the Russian authorities as undermining undermining the reputation of the Russian Federation, damaging the reputation of the Russian Federation on the international stage. Now, Vladimir, as I said, is a man with a great sense of humor, and he later wrote in an article for the Washington Post that he, of course, was flattered by this attention by the Russian authorities, but no one could ever aspire at damaging the Russian reputation on the international stage better than Vladimir Putin himself. So that accusation for 3 public speeches, accusation of high treason for 3 public speeches, is absolutely something very unthinkable. Last time someone was accused of high treason for public speeches, for public position, was Solzhenitsyn and Natan Sharansky in the Soviet times. But since Vladimir, this accusation, this article of the Russian Criminal Code is being used on an increasing basis. This morning I read of yet another case of a young boy, 21-year-old man, is the youngest one accused of high treason. The circumstances of his case are unknown because everything is happening behind closed doors, and the human rights organizations are trying to get information about that. But I can tell you about a 23-year-old Russian girl who was accused of high treason and is now facing up to 10 years in prison for sending, Russian people are not very wealthy people. She sent several donations to Ukraine that totaled $30. In several instances, she was just sending, every time she got her paycheck maybe or something, she sent something to Ukraine. $30, 10 years in prison. And according to human rights organizations, these high treason charges are brought against people basically every day nowadays across Russia. So this is why I tell that my husband's case is very, very illustrative. I could read a manual just based on his case. And that sort of describes the situation with human rights in Russia and what the regime is doing to silence dissent inside of the country. And you see, the fact is, I'm sometimes told, protests are not seen, just where are the people? First of all, let's not forget that all independent media have been destroyed in Russia. Over 200,000 online media resources have been blocked since February 2022. All remaining independent media outlets were closed down. Like TV Dozhd, that was only available online, the Echo of Moscow radio station, and Novaya Gazeta, the co-laureate of the Nobel Peace Prize in 2022. So, also, I believe that the regime would not need to use such atrocious repression techniques against people, giving them 10 years of prison for $30, or beating them, torturing them to death for putting up leaflets of the Ukrainian project I Want to Live, if there were no protests. It means that protests are ongoing, and this is why these repressive techniques are becoming increasingly harsh, increasingly cruel, because they need to show what's going to happen, like they did in the case with Artyom Kamartin, a poet who was arrested and sentenced for reading anti-war poetry at an anti-mobilization event in Moscow. He was arrested at his place of residence, and the policeman raped him with a dumbbell during arrest, while his girlfriend was being tortured in the next room. And they then made him apologize on his knees. He was then transported to a detention center and accused of inciting hatred with the use of violence. The police published this. They posted it. That video was online to show to all those who might want to read poetry in the street. just to show what might happen to them if they just dare. But the thing is, people do dare, and the authorities have to become increasingly cruel.
It's powerful, and this last question I think is a great way to maybe conclude the evening, and any additional notes you'd like to add, or points you'd like to leave us with. It reflects something I've thought for a good while. I think it's an awful shame. I have Russian friends, or speak to Russians. One should not have to feel ashamed or feel like I can't admit or say that I am Russian just because of Vladimir Putin, because of what he's doing. But I know, especially since the war, the full-scale invasion last year, there are Russians all around the world who quietly say, well, I'm careful about speaking Russian, or I'm careful about people knowing I'm Russian, even if they're completely against Putin or against what's happening. But it's absolutely, with this war, the Ukrainian people are suffering incredibly. Devastation. But I do think in time, I don't know how long it will take, they will be victorious, and it will be a long and difficult road, but the country will come out much better, much stronger, in a better position. I think the people, sadly, indirectly, that will suffer the second most are the Russian people themselves. Vladimir Putin, I think, has put Russia back a generation or more, in terms of humanity, in terms of being part of the rest of the world. Bethany also wrote the second half of this question in Russian. Bethany's from the Audi International School. Bethany, I'm sorry, I don't speak Russian, but I'll give it to Evgenia afterwards. But I think maybe it's something a similar vein. She asked a great question. In the face of so many people associating Russia's culture with the horrible Putin regime, what do you feel is the best way to preserve the culture of Russia?
Thank you very much for the questions. There's this notion of collective guilt that is being discussed yet again, and that notion was already discussed after the Second World War, and we're in a similar position now. And there is the notion of collective responsibility, and I believe that collective guilt should not exist, because we are talking about a person's responsibility, a person's guilt. You are responsible for your actions, like Father Georg Edelstein said. You're responsible for your actions, for your words, for what you do, for what you say, for what you think. Collective guilt allows those truly responsible for crimes to evade punishment, because it's basically diluted. When everyone's guilty, no one truly is. So I believe that this is a wrong notion for the 21st century, when an individual should be valued and actions of an individual should be assessed. But there is the notion of collective responsibility, and how can we, what can we do? In my opinion, again, it's just my opinion, but I think that my husband and so many people are showing it through their actions. That responsibility. The responsibility of Russians would be in making everything possible to bring down the regime. Because for as long as the regime in Russia is allowed to survive, no one will ever be safe. And I think that this has become clear by now to the entire world. I mean, my husband has been running around the world for years and years and years saying these things. Please look at this regime. Please pay attention to the fact that they've been using political assassination as a method of dealing with opposition. Please look at what happened in Chechnya and with the invasion of Georgia. Please don't look away. Do not deal with Vladimir Putin as a partner. He cannot be treated as a partner. He is a bully and a criminal, and should be dealt with as a bully and a criminal. Well, unfortunately, now that the world has finally understood but the price is too high. The price are tens of thousands of people dead. The price are whole cities destroyed. The price are millions and millions of refugees. The price are a brain drain from Russia. Hundreds of political prisoners. That is the price. Vladimir Putin is leading 2 wars at the same time, against Ukraine and against the Russian people. So our responsibility would be in doing everything possible to make sure that the world does not turn away this time, that there are no negotiations with Vladimir Putin, that there is no resetting relation with him or signing deals with him. Well, I can say that I will do my best in this regard. Our responsibility would be in calling for the formation of an international tribunal to bring all those responsible for the crime of aggression and war crimes committed in Ukraine to responsibility. And definitely our responsibility will be in calling for, what's the word? You know, there was a huge mistake made by then leaders of the early 1990s, then leaders of the new democratic Russia of the early 1990s. Actually, my husband wrote an excellent article on this that was already published in Russia on the Echo of Moscow website. And I mean, we put it up everywhere on his social media, but it is also being translated and will be published in the Washington Post, the English translated version. So, and he talks about that huge mistake that was made then, and it made it possible for Vladimir Putin to come to power. So that mistake was the refusal of then leaders to deal with the past, with the crimes of the Soviet system. That unwillingness to reflect upon them, to condemn them, and to punish them at the state level. That unwillingness to carry out lustration that would prevent former KGB officials from ever occupying positions of power in our country. That was the unwillingness to conduct a proper trial of the Communist Party and denounce and condemn and punish those responsible for the crimes committed during the Soviet times. That mistake, that unwillingness of President Yeltsin and his entourage to carry out that hugely important work made it possible for those former KGB officers or former party officials to, they just stayed low for just a few years and then they re-emerged again. And Vladimir talks about such people as, as the so-called president of our country, Vladimir Putin himself. And when he appeared on the stage, I remember people saying, who is it? No one knew who Vladimir Putin was. But in fact, Vladimir Putin himself personally participated in the interrogation and searches of Soviet dissidents. He was a mediocre FSB KGB officer who himself searched and interrogated people like Natan Sharansky, or like Vladimir Bukovsky, or like those participants in the demonstration of the Red Square. And he was allowed because there were no lustration, because there was no disbanding of these secret services, and no bringing to responsibility of those who conducted this repressive policy in the country. He was allowed to come back to power. So that is the mistake that we cannot afford making again. And I urge you to find that article by Vladimir. That was the last article that we smuggled out of prison and published as I said, the Russian version has already been published, and the English translation will appear in the coming few days in the Washington Post. Vladimir is truly a historian, so the way he describes it is much clearer and better than I will ever be able to do.
You're excellent.
But I do trust his opinion, and I completely share it. I do understand where this all comes from, and I do understand that we cannot afford making this mistake again. As for Russian culture, you know, the regime is trying to expropriate, to appropriate that part of Russian culture that we hold very dear, but they don't get Svetaeva. They don't get to have Tolstoy. They don't understand that. Tolstoy was one of the most anti-war writers in the history of human literature. They're not gonna, you know, nope, this is ours. We're not giving up the spoils of this Silver Age. We're not giving up those writers that made me. I grew up reading this literature, and I'm incredibly grateful that I was exposed to this literature, because my understanding of empathy, my understanding of humanity, my understanding of kindness comes from that. And they're not going to be able to spoil that. We're not going to let them.
Again, I wanted to thank Professor Charles Dove from Rice Cinema and everyone at Rice University. And I want to thank you all again for coming. And again, if you want any more information more broadly on the kind of search for human rights and the kind of various people involved at all levels, I invite you all to look at the Free Russia Foundation website. And in particular, if you're interested in supporting the families of political prisoners in Russia, like I said, many of these families, they've lost the one salary that they might have had, small salary, and barely getting by. The 30th October Foundation is as that Evgenia mentioned, is excellent. And lastly, I'm just incredibly impressed and humbled and I feel just honored to be here with you today. And your courage and your conviction is incredible. And will you all join me in thanking Evgenia Kara-Murza.